Well, it is wonderful to have this really special guest today on our podcast, St. Tammy, Eric Weinberg. Thank you so much for coming and joining us and talking about, your expertise and everything that you're going to unravel. And yeah, it's just great to connect with everyone today. And I'm really excited about this special conversation.
Yeah, so as some of you guys listening know, that we've been working on a documentary that's coming out soon, and Eric was a research consultant on this documentary, and we had some really interesting conversations about um, putting, the story of Tammy in a kind of more historical, sociological, like political context, and some of the ideas that Eric had. I mean, Eric wrote a PhD on PTL and Jim and Tammy, and I thought it was really fascinating, and it's something that's, you know, maybe some of you guys will find interesting as well. I always like to hear about what wider sort of social historical moments, how they impact individuals, and what sort of individuals say about as symptoms of like a wider culture. So really excited to have that conversation.
Thank you. Appreciate it. No, I love that, this is a fascinating subject. Obviously, I've been involved in it. And, some of my original interest in it was that as a historian, I felt nobody was looking at it. It seemed, that it had been such a cultural phenomenon, and nobody was sort of taking it seriously as a cultural moment, as a historical moment. And so my original, as interest was to sort of dive in and see what I could find out about this thing that nobody was looking at. And so that was my original my original origin story, I suppose, in the topic. And I can try to start if that's what we want to talk, a sort of like give the background with don't go too far back on how I see Jim and Tammy, specifically Tammy, kind of fitting into that moment of American history. And I think one way to do this, to talk about two things and two people and two subjects that happened before them. One was Sister Amy, Amy Semple McPherson. And in the 30s, she had this discussion, and Tammy's, her focus on the individual and self-betterment, and Jim's focus on prosperity. All of these discussions contrast with when Sister Amy had a speech where she I think it was called Prosperity or something along those lines, and she continually talked about how to make California better, how to make the United States better, how to make all these other things better, to bring prosperity, however you define that term. But American culture was lacking in understanding of the connection between that and the individual. It just wasn't part of the cultural lexicon. It certainly wasn't part of the religious or Pentecostal or evangelical lexicon at the time. It was a different time. Another example of this sort of different way of thinking and understanding people's relationship with their culture was these dime stores books, these Horatio Alger stories about prosperity and coming up and becoming something different. In there, anybody that did anything for the betterment of their self was called what the book would call a confidence man, a scoundrel. And in religious terms, this person would have been seen sort of demonic. And so there just wasn't a cultural language at this time to talk the way in which Jim and Tammy talked about the individual. And so no sense of individual, no language of this sort of religious cultural movement. And so, right, in Oprah, a lot of these, there was a smaller movement that sort of had this sort of thing. It became when Oprah Winfrey made famous the book, The Gift. But these were small cultural movements that sort of wrestled, maybe in very problematic ways, maybe in some extreme ways, with newer understanding of people. And what it means. The idea of psychology itself had not been invented. So the idea that self-betterment as the terms of psychology had not been there. So there's all this cultural language just missing from these earlier religious movements, from social movements, from cultural movements. whether extreme or not in these senses. But after World War II, there's a whole lot of transformations. American prosperity, consumer culture, people breaking away from their ethnic neighborhoods, their ethnic churches, brings forth a new language. Psychology becomes around, and people start talking about themselves, of bettering themselves, not as, and this being okay, right? This language of bettering the self, right? Or as we often hear, is I'm doing this for what's in the best interest of me. That kind of language wasn't around. And so this begins to grow alongside new groups of religious people, originally starting, most historians would say, amongst people who are growing around these Sunbelt cities like North Carolina, these sort of prosperous new cities, who are saying the religion of this current world doesn't fit me. And they begin to search for a sort of new religiosity, a new form of that could speak to Americans in the current context. And so a lot of these people get involved with Jim Baker, but they also they're associated with Pat Robertson. And so they begin to meld, but in this melding, they begin to find this whole new group of people that are disconnected from their own ethnic neighborhoods. They're living in a new world where, right, they're working in jobs that demands personal transformation, like be your best self, go out and sell for us, go out and be your best person, and they're experience a world that talks in this language. And in many ways, Jim and Tammy grab onto this new transformation and this new language that allows them to speak to these new groups of people, and they follow through to these cities where these people who are disconnected. It's no coincidence. Charlotte, North Carolina, this booming growth city of people who had moved out of their ethnic neighborhoods, were searching for connection, and were involved with places that demanded this new understanding of themselves, were often isolated in their new neighborhoods, away from their more traditional linked family, from their, whether it is an Irish neighborhood, even a Jewish neighborhood, a Catholic, church and neighborhood. They were interested in finding a new way to connect. And so, in my understanding, while I'm not by any means saying Jim and Tammy, or Jim or Tammy thought these ideas explicitly, or that they themselves or everyone who was involved in these movements thought about them in the same sense, I think they had a particularly amazing way to speak to these cultural trends in American society after World War II. And so in American society after World War II was surprising, was fairly unified. Like the difference between Republican and Democrat at that time was fairly minor. Right. And when people, in fact, people had talked about the end of conflict in the world was going to happen. There was these articles and essays that existed. And so this idea of the end of conflict and prosperity, it was all throughout American and culture. But in the 1970s, with economic stagflation, globalization, all these other things put this to a halt. And in many ways, there was a fight over what happened to this dream. How are we all of a sudden at the immediate day we're saying no, this reality? And often I think, when I think about the way to do this, to ask people to give up on this vision was often asking them to give up on themselves, because so much of this culture had been not necessarily about individual prosperity, although that's part of it. It had been about accepting the individual and seeing things through the individual, whether it's psychology, individual betterment, and that sort of thing. And all of a sudden, to give that up for many people was to give up. And there became, I think, a cultural intersection or war, or however we want to phrase it, and people searching for a way to continue to find a way to support this trend. You could contrast it with Jimmy Carter's famous Malaise speech, where he's talking about giving up on sacrifice. A lot of people thought this was a form of giving up on America or giving up on a dream. And so this was a contrast. And I think we can, for me, we can see Jim and Tammy within this. They were providing this essence or this need or this place for this the revival or the maintenance or the continued embrace of parts, if not all, or elements of people who had gone into this or had embraced this universal ideal that had come out of World War II, that in many ways had come out of the environment that America was in after the war, and they were the remaining Western superpower in the world. And I think they became had an ability to speak to people who were oftentimes more secluded, oftentimes living in these suburbs, were working in jobs that demanded personal transformation. Some of these newer sale jobs, you'd have to go out and become someone else on one day and just do this and go back and transform yourself. It's a very emotionally demanding kind of a thing to do that over and over again. And I think in many ways, these sort of emotional backbone of a lot of what PTL do could speak to those types of people who are involved in those types of emotionally demanding jobs and so forth. And I won't go on too much, go on forever and about that, but I think those are kind of the outlines of some of the factors I think that went into that. And I think what they did fit into this cultural environment that had also many sprockets that we could go off on as well.
It's super interesting because I think that like wider cultural thing, because there's definitely this shift. I mean, America in the 20th century is so fascinating, and going from that more unified post-war, which obviously saw the like real rapid rise of Jim and Tammy, and then this sudden division towards the 70s as things began to sort of unravel economically. But also, I mean, like how today it's just interesting that Tammy is having the sort of second coming, this kind of revival with this universalist message. And maybe it says something about today that there is this, like you were saying, that even during this period where things were getting more divisive, and also where people were getting more alienated with the transforming society, that people found real solace in watching Jim and Tammy. But there's something about Tammy that like brings solace as well today to some people, that they kind of are looking for that universalist message. But yeah, and it's also interesting, I thought, what you were saying about because obviously there's a big backlash against Jim and Tammy in the late 80s, and on the one hand, maybe you have these different approaches maybe to deal with a more divisive time. You have, like, on the one hand, the religious right and moral majority who are kind of looking to maybe return to some past that's not recoverable, and then you have also on the other side people who are not religious at all and maybe who see religion as the problem. But Jim and Tammy were doing something quite different from, is often, I mean, especially from the outside of the States, there's always this idea of like Christianity equals Republican right wing, blah, 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 blah. But Jim and Tammy weren't, Jim refused to participate in the moral majority at the end of the day, and I think they were representing something slightly different. So it's interesting how they kind of got caught up in one, before the 70s maybe, in sort of this rise of universalism, and rode that wave, and then obviously as things changed, then they sort of got the backlash of that as people were sort of dealing with that. I don't know what, because obviously Jay, you have a lot of thoughts about this.
Well, I mean, for me it seems like, I think what some people wanted to do with politics, and it's funny that Eric mentions this, like, individuality, because it's something that, right, like now I see a lot of like progressive Christians be like, oh, no personal Jesus, blah, blah, and we want community, but then they really don't want community, even though they pretend they do. And I think what my folks saw with like politics and things like that was like, is that you did kind of lose the individual. And there was either like, they wanted the whole group to be martyrs, the whole groups to be, fall in line. And I think both of my parents grew up like early evangelicalism, where people were able to kind of, where it was always just the pastor talking to the group and the group being like bad. If someone's, you're bad, you're sinners, you're this, you're that. And I think my parents just thought, this doesn't, it seemed like they were like, this doesn't seem like good news, and I think what my dad saw with the Christian right coming up, the Jerry Falwell's group, the moral majority, is that kind of same thing of like that group think of, oh, it's us against them. And I just feel like my parents, which is really ironic because my dad's changed so much now, but back then I just don't think they saw that there was a them, that there was an other, that we were all in this together, and it wasn't about Republican or Democrat or even Christian or non-Christian. I mean, my dad's message kind of boiled down to, you're loved, God loves you. And, and he used to say, God loves you, he really does. But I feel like my dad was kind of saying, God loves you, and it doesn't matter what you think. You know what I mean? It was just like, you're loved and God loves you and God cares about you and we care about you. And I think they both grew up with that division, especially my mother, seeing her mom go through the divorce and everything like that, and how she was ostracized. And my mom came from such a big family. And I think my dad saw a lot of that too. He was, abused by a pastor and different things like that. And I think they saw a lot of the legalism and judgmentalism, and in a lot of ways they were trying to rebel against that, and especially a blanket way, because it was just, I don't think there was, in an odd way, I would say, like, there didn't seem to be anybody, like, individuals weren't really looked at, so it was even like, it wasn't just like where there's one person who's the problem, it's everybody's the problem. And I think you lost yourself in that. And I think my parents wanted to be like, you don't have to lose yourself in that, but we can also go through this together, because there was also this kind of thing of like, it's so funny that my dad was into prosperity, but a lot of his prosperity was because he had to pay bills, because there was also a lot of, you can make it. So there was a lot of ideals of like, times are tough, life is hard, but you can pull through life, and the good news is that God's not against you, I guess, was kind of the thing. So it's really interesting to hear from a different perspective of, something you grew up in, and then, heard
but it is interesting as
like
well,
that.
like how, because, there's so, one of the things I think is just so fascinating is just how representative they are of the epoch. So obviously we're talking about like the tension between the individual and sort of the universal. And on the one hand, that there is this element of like PTL, for instance, like appealing to wide audiences and not being denominational, so it has that universal side. But then also there is this individual, you can make it, self-betterment. But then also the same, on a more like structural level, that Jim and Tammy obviously like are individual actors, but they represent so much. They really capture the 20th century. And even like you mentioned, Jim, and I'd be really fascinated to hear your thoughts on this, Eric, about Jim's transformation, like as in what he was doing post-war, and then his 45-year sentence, and where he's gone today, and like maybe where that fits. Do you have any thoughts about where that fits into the sort of current historical?
I'm not sure historians always avoid the president like a plague. We think, oh no, that's not our job. So I'm not sure how well prepared I am for that, but I'll speculate a little bit, for better or worse. And so also, sort of respond to what and I can't imagine if a historian jumped in and explained my life. I can't even imagine what that would do to me. So I can't.
It's literally like opening up like a different window. You know what I mean? Like, you just a window you've not really looked and go, oh yeah, it's a bit, it's like radical theology, where you take that step back and you kind of even look at the bigger picture. So it's kind of great. Yeah.
Well, cool. Yeah. And I think what he said fit well with what just to say what I, some of the way in which they were able to open up a language that, like with some people have criticized for some aspects, but other aspects are there. But in many ways, the idea of self-fulfillment, individual betterment, even prosperity, like, are not necessarily political or controversial on their basic ends. They've kind of become the normal language of American society. And so when we talk about revival and Tammy and this, and I think a lot of people were critical during the time period, and for various reasons, and I don't think I have to go down those roads. But when we look back at a lot of their messaging, I think it was ahead of the time at meeting people where they were at. And that transformations in World War II had happened to the point that individual lives, the old language of us, whether it's austerity or legalism, just didn't fit people's lives, that, they were in these sort of isolated suburbs, living in nuclear family households, trying to navigate the world as an individual in a sort of burgeoning consumer culture where you're not necessarily part of a Irish neighborhood or this sort of thing. And so I think they found that language spoke to people in many ways. And so I think that's part of why Tammy's revival, is because people are realizing that, when Oprah can go on and go with, some would say, the more extreme version of The Gift, and that can't, from a maybe left-wing perspective, at the same time, other people, you realize that some of these ideas are more universal, even though there are extremes to them. But thinking of people and self-betterment and those sorts of things cross over a lot and have been stabilized in American society in ways that we don't always realize or want to realize. And so I think people are realizing that they had a larger effect and more commonality with some of the messaging that came out than that they want to realize. And I think that's part of the revival, is people reassessing both their influence and some of the foundations of what they had said and their importance. And so as far as Tammy is concerned, and sort of the revival is part of it, I think it's, much like during the pandemic in America, everyone went back to the American version of The Office, and it just sort of made sense to them again. I think, Tammy, people are going back to Tammy and saying, wait a minute, she still makes quite a bit of sense, and maybe even more sense than she may have in the past. And I think from a more less critical eye, people are realizing that and then their importance. And I think even, some of the critics might also realize that, for better or worse, that they were transformative. I don't, as influence that they were on most of the television ministries of the time is undeniable. And so, and I think, without, attempt to sort of separate us, but I think that experience Jim and Tammy had growing up, and Jake can probably speak to this better than I can, because I'm just speaking from their own writings. They really showed that they were caught between two worlds, the old world and the new world, and they could see how it didn't fit with this new world. And they were trying to find a translation, a train to bring forth their more legalistic religion into the present context, to meet the people that they knew in high school and their friends and so forth. And I think this led them to, I mentioned that group of people who are already, maybe from a more economic perspective, trying to transform religion in that ways. And they became spokespeople because they could speak to both, maybe the economic side, maybe that was just to pay bills, but they could all speak to the other side of it, the sort of individualistic, transformative side that could speak to people on a one-to-one basis. And so multiple groups were possibly, and I know from my research, not everyone went to PTL for the same reason, right? For one person who went there for prosperity and sort of economic reality, somebody else went there because they were struggling and they found the message transformative in that way. But they found a way to wrap their new vision enough around the ability to meet people in this new wave. And so I think, just like Pat Robertson and Jim Baker, they both were surrounded around people who were embracing that. And Jim in particular had the ability to bring this in front of the camera to the people. And I think everyone who saw him saw that ability to be in front of the camera and do that. And so while other groups had sort of seen the light in these new visions and new ideology, nobody was able to translate it the way he was. And so I think that came on. And then I think Tammy also, from those early days, as soon as she was put in front of the camera, it was quick to realize that there may be also something that even further was missing. And I think that narrative of what goes on from there is a whole different narrative that both fit that need, but also brought in whole new audiences that I think starts at the same place, right? The same need to speak to people where they were and individuals in a more or less legalistic society. But I think she grew that same understanding to meet needs of new groups of people and branch out. And I think having that starting point allowed her to expand upon, well, if this is true, then why isn't this true? And I think for all the negative that can go along with the idea of having a more individual focused religion, there's also opportunity. And I think Tammy found that opportunity and particularly well. You could argue that, why didn't she resist this or this or this? But I think Tammy was pretty adept at playing almost a trickster, right? Going on a very conservative, as a woman who is not supposed to paint your face and this, and then doing it in a way that let people know that, what, I'm not your, you're not going to control me. I'm going to be myself. I'm going to be who I want to be. And I think she was, oftentimes described as some sort of puppet in that sense. And I think it was just the opposite. I think that in many ways, she was, by doing what she did, she was making a statement against the place that put her in front. She was a female televangelist in a world that had still not accepted women as having set a role. And so the idea that her going up there and doing what she did was somehow subservient or accepting of male hierarchy in a more traditional way, I think misses a lot of the sort of playing she was doing with taking trends and maybe pushing them in ways that let herself be an image or a mirror into the sort of her understanding what it means to have a religion focus on people as individuals and how that could maybe evolve.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I do feel like maybe in terms of the revival of Tammy and reassessing that, obviously often there's you're the historian, so I could be wrong about this, but sometimes historical moments or cultural moments happen in a very reactive way. So, you have traditional marriage, and then you have certain, say, feminist movements that maybe, suggest no marriage at all, or don't be subservient to your husband or whatever. But, that Tammy, just because she was married or in a traditional marriage, or whatever, didn't mean that she wasn't doing things that were very radical for her context. And I think that maybe there's a sort of a reassessment of that as well.
Yeah. And, in the 80s were such a wild time. The 1980s were everything was happening, you know what I mean? But at the same time, it was funny, my parents were kind of punished for being individuals, even by the SNL cast and, late night shows and things like that, which it was, but it's almost there was these episodes of Quincy where they had punk rock guys, these kids who were supposed to be punk rockers, and they were throwing guitars and throwing people off roofs and stuff. It was everything was kind of, if it wasn't understood, it was kind of villainized, And so the 80s was such a strange time because everything could go, but then not everybody. So you kind of did have the old, the old 70s culture kind of oh, what is this? And then you have my mom with the makeup and everything. And it was interesting that how people didn't unnecessarily understand who they were and really celebrated their fall in kind of a scapegoaty way. But at the same point, when I think about my mom, she just really was someone, and my dad, they weren't your average married couple in a way that they had marriage problems, and they dealt with them, not always in the most healthy ways, but they had, they knew about each other's issues and went through that. But also my dad wasn't cooking meat on the grill on the weekends. You know what I mean? My parents would decorate together. You know what I mean? Something that my people would probably see more remember it was meta, what was it, the Metamel or whatever, kind of oh, is he he kind of has the feminine side, and my dad had both those. So he was like, oh, I love to like decorate with my wife, and we go antiquing together and we do stuff like that, you know. And so they were really an interesting, you know, couple. Like it was just, it wasn't your average, like, you know, man. And I mean, I didn't know anything about sports growing up because my dad just wasn't into sports. He wasn't into that. So there wasn't like, because I think people want to like, oh, Tammy was the first feminist. But for her and my dad, it was kind of like this role of like, oh, we're doing this thing together and we've got to have each other to continue to move this thing forward, you know. And what's interesting to see how they navigated that time period that they were in. Because for me, I'm seeing their personalities through this. But when you hear a historian talk about it, you go, oh, there's this bigger thing at play, you know. And it's just interesting how they kind of, it was like, and I guess this is anyway with anybody who becomes famous and popular like this, is it's like that perfect storm. Like they were kind of born into the right time for such a time as this, you know what I mean? And so that's it's so interesting to see how that happened and how they became so popular, but also like how they became, you know, what I wonder what, you know, what in that time too caused them to become villains, you know, when they lost everything, like why they were scapegoated so badly for more of, I think, the sins of people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and you know, Oral Roberts and people like that who are doing the more like fighting the sin of everybody. Like my parents didn't seem like they were fighting this people, telling people to fight their sin. They were trying to get people to accept themselves and survive. And it felt like a lot of these other evangelists were very much like, oh no, the gays and the abortion and you know, because all that kind of stuff was just coming up. And my parents were kind of like, well, those are just human issues, you know? And I felt like the other people saw it as sin, you know?
It's interesting because I feel like as well, you're saying, you know, people becoming famous in a perfect storm. So it feels as well that with the fall, it was sort of a perfect storm. And obviously, I think Eric speaks this a lot. But one of the issues, and I think we've talked about it before, Eric, is maybe a sort of classism, you know, that this was this period leading up to the fall was, you know, there was a sort of a rise in prosperity for different sections of America. And, you know, for instance, you talked about how lots of people watched Jim to sort of pump themselves up as salesmen. And, you know, today we have sort of service industry jobs. And back then there was a big rise in sales industry jobs. So that people were sort of identifying with Jim and using him as a sort of like, you know, pep kind of person, but that this was like a new type of job. It wasn't like a legacy job. And there's we actually in the documentary have a passage where Pat Robertson really sort of goes at Jim and Tammy for being sort of, you know, working class and not having the right, you know, values and all this kind of stuff. So I wonder if there's an element of that. But also it's interesting in terms of, I've always been interested in the sort of bizarre election sequence, or maybe not bizarre, but just interesting election sequence from Jimmy Carter to Reagan, and how Jimmy Carter, who's quite a left-wing guy, was an evangelical, but then he didn't represent, you know, a lot of the issues that some of the more right-wing, obviously like a large part of evangelicalism in America maybe identifies more with, you know, right-wing values. And so then there was the rise of moral majority and they got Reagan elected. And then maybe there was this sort of, therefore, from a more media perspective, more media class perspective, a universal kind of suspicion of religious people, even though, as we've said already, Jim and Tammy weren't really part of that traditional evangelicalism from that more sort of Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating, and in many ways that time period of, you know, well, at least up until recently, has defined the sort of political divisions in American society, right? And, you know, where I started talking about, you know, Jimmy Carter and his focus on limits and limit-based liberalism is often what people talk about as the idea in the 1970s, liberalism or the left, or however we define it, was all about how can we limit things? We limit gas, we limit our spending, we limit our global reach. That discussions globally about population destruction of the world. I mean, a lot of this environmental catastrophe, and all these were on the the sort of zeitgeist of American society and the left, and despite the fact that Carter was an evangelical and born and bred and spoke the language, I think in many ways he had missed the time on that, the way in which that language could translate. I don't think and he was reading a lot of times. He had consultants with people like historian and cultural critic Christopher Lash, and many people who are bringing up these ideas within there. And they didn't translate, not to a culture that had so transformed since the 1950s. And I think, Reagan came in and brought back in many ways a vision that more fit what Jim and Tammy had talked about. But all this is where I'm not talking wrapped in a new understanding of the family that had become enveloped in surrounding a lot of this stuff at the time. But I think if we look at this solely as a sort of, that doesn't make sense. But I think if you think about their worldview and how in which they intersect with these transformations after World War II, when these ideas were solidified, Reagan spoke to that old time. He spoke to that old vision. And Jim and Tammy, in many ways, their new vision of helping the individual, of giving the individual prosperity, and all these sorts of things, they were more in line with Reagan than they were with Carter. And so Carter's hope to sort of bring America back to this new limit-based liberalism, or this idea of how do we contract and how do we do less. For the first part, it's America. We are not good at doing less. Right. We always want to find more. Kind of, it also telling people who are struggling to pay their heating bills to put on a sweater seems somewhat tone deaf as well. But the combination of the ideology, the time, and the ask, and what had gone before didn't fit. So I think the intersection of Reagan and his growing understanding of the evangelical movement created a new intersection and a new sort of political force that would align itself and allow itself to exist. Because Carter was, I think, towing a sled that was possibly going a bit uphill, even if at the time he probably heard a lot of convincing arguments, and maybe correct arguments. I'm not going to make the argument whether one was right or wrong. Nonetheless, it would have taken more than a speech to get people who had since the 1950s been told a story to get off that cart right now, and think about a community, the world as a sort of community, or local world as a community, rather than themselves as individuals, when their jobs, lives, family, all of that was focused on them and their betterment and how they can make their family succeed, rather than, the neighbor who I haven't met in, 10 years somehow is part of my community. Our communities are much more complex. And I think Jim and Tammy's could speak better to that. And I think Reagan could as well. And so I think in many ways that was more natural of an intersection than some people have suggested. Yeah. And I think it goes beyond the sort of traditional, this group was about moral values, and this group was not about moral values. I think Carter had strong moral values too. I just think it was couched in a vision that didn't fit America at the time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, his moral values seem to be more for the people rather than individuals, if I would, kind of go with what I think was happening there. And also just to I don't know what you think about this, Eric, as a kind of a hypothesis, but for the fall when my parents fell, I feel like what we had was, you still kind of had the liberal, the Carter left a bit, who kind of resented, feeling that my parents represented kind of a Reagan era, anything goes, it's the 80s, that kind of were like, oh, we knew Jim and Tammy were going to fall and do this and blah, blah, blah. And then you really had a lack of depth in a lot of the more Reagan era thinking. And so it was very easy for the Reagan folks, the new conservatives, to kind of go like, oh, well, failure is not part of our vision. So they failed. And you kind of have both groups just completely turn, and which is interesting because Christianity, I've spent 30 years of my life studying, is kind of a faith that's based on, the first earliest New Testament writing in Galatians, Paul talks about, when someone falls, you should gently and humbly, help them back up, and you should restore them and do these type of things. But what you have is you have the left and the right both just kind of go like, it's like one of those funny movies where like somebody goes into stage dive and then everybody splits and the person just hits the ground. You know what I mean? It was like my parents fell and everybody just kind of was like, not our problem, not our problem. And my parents just kind of hit the ground, my family really. And so I think that can also be seen as kind of the perfect storm, is that neither they're just, I guess it was the lack of success on one side was the failure for the more Reaganomics type of thing. And then the left was just kind of like, well, we were always kind of suspicious. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, it feels like that's what happened.
I think it does, and I think in some ways the critique of them was really a critique of the 1980s, and they became somewhat of a scapegoat for the excesses of the country. And people were, probably, traveling on yachts and saying, oh, look at these excessive people, right? Right. And maybe some of their critique was justified, but maybe look in the mirror a little bit too, right? And I think in some ways the picture was painted of them, but the lack of a picture was painted of America, right? And exactly. And I think America didn't realize that they, in many ways, were on the same ship, and may have been a part of the same group, and may have been part of the same era, and so I think in many ways, the critique was maybe a self-critique. That when the 1980s didn't end well, when the Reaganomics left a lot of problems and subgroups without a lot, and failed to maybe help a broad spectrum of society. People were critiquing that, and I think they found a way to make it not about them or the America, but about two individuals and a religious movement. And I think, some of that I think was going on. And I think the 1980s were an interesting time, but I think Jim and Tammy weren't the only people who were celebrating a vision of prosperity and success. That may have been what drove Reagan to the presidency as well. And so Jim and Tammy just were willing to say it a little louder, I think, sometimes, and that's what was often used as a way to use that as to use them as a sort of pincushion, or however we want to.
Yeah, because there was this element of authenticity and openness, and they've been called sort of the first, well, your family has been called the first family of reality television, and this is obviously part of their appeal in terms of, you were talking about the rising loneliness and this era, and people feeling alienated and connecting to PTL as some sort of like surrogate family through the medium of television. But they were very honest. But that honesty, and I think there's an interview that we have of Tammy sort of in despair, because she's saying, well, what we've done is no worse than anybody else. You should see what these guys do. But, obviously there are maybe different values and different ways of sort of communicating it. And there's statistics about how Jim and Tammy made $8 million in record royalties and book sales over the course that they took $4 million in salary, but they gave the ministry $8 million of their income that they could have taken. So if they had just taken the royalties and not a salary, there wouldn't have been this sort of big scandal. And I always think it's really funny when you hear about the things that really captured the imagination. So the air-conditioned doghouse. One time they're in a hotel room, and Don, who was a security guard, bought $100 worth of cinnamon rolls to put in the oven to warm them up to create a scent of cinnamon rolls in the hotel room. And then the gold-plated faucets and things like this. when you compare them to the excesses of today, this is the thing that's really scary, because we always have this repeat of, I don't know, some aspects of the Reagan period, because when you think about, like, Elon Musk's wealth increasing by 100 billion in 1 year, or you see that what sort of the billionaire class on their yachts do these days, it's nothing. $100 of cinnamon rolls, really not very much, or like a dog house with a heater in. But it's interesting that, I guess what I was getting at is just that their openness that was so key to their success in this period also opened them up to this sort of being the useful kind of stooge when it came to, like, absolving the community, the wider American society, of the guilt of having engaged in the ethics of the 80s. That they were sort of like, haha, well, look, they've honestly said things, but the honesty was what really made them famous in the first place.
And I think too, there's also that growing up, and I think what my parents were rebelling against too is that, like, oh, you should be the poor pauper if you're going to be the preacher. You need to be be poor and not have money and blah blah blah. And so, and what's funny is to think about my family, like, it's like, oh well, we had a pool, so that was nice, but we also were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken next to the pool. Like, I don't like, we didn't do a lot of fancy things. Like, when I remember, like, after we lost everything and I started seeing what wealthy people actually do, I was like, we never went to the Grand Cayman Islands, or we never went to all these great places that I hear all these rich people do, it's just weird, because it was like, they did have a house in Palm Springs, which was nice, but Palm Springs was also at the end of its glory day and it was falling apart. And then the other one was like near Dollywood in Tennessee, and like one of the most redneck areas, visiting the redneck Riviera, basically. And so it was like, it was funny to see, like, how people created, like, gold faucets. Well, no, they're brass faucets. Nobody has gold faucets. You know what I mean? It's like $100 worth of cinnamon rolls, which I'm sure my parents weren't like, go out and buy $100 cinnamon roll. Don probably thought, oh, this will be hilarious and great. So it's weird to see that. Not that I'm saying they were completely innocent of not having a lifestyle that was too big or too that, but it's just, it's so strange to see how people remember it, and think about it and celebrate that. And the other side is here we are in the 2023, and a few months ago, I was talking online about how I live in federal housing, like low income housing, and someone, like, this other progressive liberal person, attacks me and goes, well, you're just doing that to show off. Like, you could probably live anywhere you want. And I'm like, no, I can't. I have 2 kids I'm trying to raise. I don't have a big ministry. I'm not, people might know who I am. I might have a blue check on Twitter, but that's about it. It's like, I'm struggling. But how it was still turned into this kind of vilifying way from a progressive person saying, and I'm a lefty myself, but still saying, like, oh, you're just, trying to show off. You're trying to say, oh, look, poor humble me. So it's kind of like what I found in this world, and probably one of the things that's probably the worst thing about religion, and is that both sides just want to scapegoat you constantly. Just, like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And I guess that's one of the things I've learned about the American culture, at least, is that just there's always a judgment for you. Nothing's ever quite good enough. And there's someone who's always trying to look at what separates us. I mean, individualism has become so strange that it's become about the I, and how I've got and I'm the right person, and you're not as right on as I am. You're not as either conservative as I am, or you're not as liberal as I am. And it's kind of really gotten out of hand, in my opinion.
But it's interesting, because I wonder, Eric, if you think that part of the reason why they were so vilified was the religious element, that this was to do with, because I see, as Jay said, like, America's a very religious country, not only confessionally, but also just in terms of those dynamics that seem to exist from the outside, this quite legalistic and oppositional sometimes. But but in this period in the late 80s, presumably from a historical perspective, there was this idea of, is religion really the right thing for us? Should it have such a strong influence on the culture? And you had, the likes of Jim Jones happening around the similar time, and maybe it was partly the issue was they represented religion, and that religion was maybe something that was being questioned at the time.
Right. There was definitely, which is a bit ironic, a stereotype of Jim and Tammy, and I think of people who went to PTL as being Southern bumpkins, sort of maybe a traditional stereotype of a sort of Pentecostal from the mountains who, doesn't have their teeth and is too ignorant to understand what Jim and Tammy were saying. While coexisting around another stereotype of Jim and Tammy of they were too prosperous and religion shouldn't be doing all this fancy stuff. And so it's like, well, wait, what? You can't have both. And so, which is a fascinating coexistence of these two ideas. But I think, I think America was struggling to understand the role of religion in society at the time. And so, right, the more traditional vision of a preacher of having to live in poverty, these sorts of visions could coexist, with the vision of a sort of more modern or prosperous or over the top, however you want to put it. And so I think it was America grasping with itself at that time. And so people could see Jim and Tammy the way they questioned these things. They were wrestling with them, and Jim and Tammy sat up on a pedestal and they became a symbol of one thing or a symbol of another thing, depending on their perspective of the world. And so they became symbolic more than real in that sense. I mean, they were real, obviously, but the critique of them could be related to what somebody was thinking about of religion at the time. And so, I think in some ways, I think I'm curious on what Jim had, his vision of how this would have happened. But in some ways, the idea of the gold-plated faucets and so forth, and a lot of the doghouse and so forth. In many ways, the ideas behind prosperity and prosperity theology is that you have to demonstrate. You have to demonstrate prosperity in order to make people believe in prosperity, and so much it's more than just a personal belief. It's related to, and Jay, you may have a thought on this too. It's also a need to pay the bills, right? If you start showing, broken down houses, less than plush accommodations, it doesn't speak to your vision of the future. And so it was as much about economic need as it was because those people who were coming to PTL because they embraced that vision had to bring in money in order to make it survive for people who maybe were not. And so I think in many ways it was also a reality of the movement they were in as much as it was a personal belief. And maybe Jim's later transformations could be suggestive of the way in which he was tied into this economic need and pipeline of people who had led to the early growth of the movement through their involvement, the Full Gospel Men Businessmen's Fellowship International, who underwrote TBN and were involved in PTL, but were also involved in CBN in those early days. But I think it becomes more than just about personal belief. It becomes about economic necessity. And there's a complexity there that I don't think has ever been acknowledged enough to the way in which success was dependent on those sort of interactions.
There's an interesting fact, I don't know if this is true, but something that I've always sort of thought is quite interesting in terms of the phenomenon of religious broadcasting at the time. So apparently I heard somebody, a lady who's an expert in American religion, said that the FCC didn't allow this kind of Pentecostal religious broadcasting on mainstream television. So they couldn't advertise in the usual way, which meant they had to go independent. And it's interesting, seeing often the religious world is a place, because it's outside the sort of mainstream, where weird innovations can happen more readily in a way, because it's sort of, you know, a bit more liberalized, because it's not so controlled. But the FCC, wouldn't allow Pentecostals to broadcast, so they had to raise money through this form of fundraising, which obviously, in a way, like all businesses have to make money somehow. But again, to go back to the honesty thing, you know, it's a little bit sort of, you know, here cap in hand versus the more sort of like acceptable advertising, where you sort of get to take your hand off and be like, oh no, I'm not involved in this. This is your decision to pick. Do you see what I mean? So that kind of maybe they're kind of between a rock and a hard place in a way, because they're forced into this position, but this allows them to be sort of innovative and to grow, but also they have to raise money somehow, and this is the way that they're sort of forced to raise money.
Right. And I think the fact that they were innovative, were able to build off these cultural movements, were exactly that reason, is they couldn't just sit on a public access channel and do the more traditional broadcast that you would see, because they had to find their niche, they had to find their audience. And there was a group of people who had become disconnected as a, you know, I don't have to go through that. And I think they found that group, and that group became the economic undergirth of their movement. Some of them were the wealthy businessmen who were funding it, but other people were searching for a new emotional understanding of religion. Some people were searching for a way to understand their new lives and those sorts of things. But you're exactly right that you know, with the understanding of the FCC and how they defined what was acceptable as far as religious broadcasting, you know, made them particularly needy of finding a way to meet the needs of American culture. And it's no coincidence that the more traditional denominations did not go down that path, because they were not motivated enough to need to. Jim and Tammy could read the tea leaves, and they needed to read the tea leaves.
Yeah, exactly. No, but it is interesting how, there's the upshot and the downside. You know, the upshot is this innovation, but the downside is that, and it is interesting that I think that America is a very, you know, obviously market orientated and capitalistic country, but sort of also works on repressing that, and there being acceptable ways of being a capitalist, you know, or because in a way, it's just a different form of money raising and convincing people to part with their money. But you know, this happens in all kinds of different ways in American culture. Do you have any sort of final thoughts? Maybe I was thinking about what you think about Tammy's legacy today, if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we haven't talked about, which I'm sure you can talk about, is the way in which you know, this, you know, there can be, you know, we can talk about the role of the community and individual, and all get complex, and, you know, religious critiques on both sides. And many people would can talk about Tammy and Jim's role in one side or the other. But I think, you know, one thing I think it did allow Tammy to do is accept all individuals where they are and for who they are. And I think while some people could be critical of other aspects, prosperity theology, those aspects, it did allow, I think, Tammy the space for her to accept people into her faith that would not have ever found a home in this environment. And I think that is one legacy that should never be forgotten about Tammy. So while even those who are critical of, you know, there's plenty of Christian groups that are critical of the more individualistic nature of American society, and then and in proxy religious society, it did open some doors in that aspect and brought new people in that that would not have been, I don't think would have been possible if they both didn't start looking at faith as an individual process. And so I think that is one important aspect, is as complex as these social and cultural trends are, they often have shoots that you can be critical of and embrace at one time. But I think Tammy was willing to accept, even though she was on this particular path, she could drive it in a way that brought in more people into the movement that would not have been possible without. So sometimes it's about what you do with what you're given as much as it is what you're given. So I think that's an important aspect of it.
Yeah, well, that's well said. Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
I know we're wrapping up, but I just wanted to say, like, I know, like, for a lot of people, the individual, personal Jesus, if you will, kind of thing is frightening. But in some ways, that's, like, for people like myself, we're very introverted, and I think it allows you to have this relationship without this, constant judgment. And I think that's what a lot of people were looking for. And I think they found with people like my mom, especially the television, is that, they didn't have to go into a community where they felt judged for who they were, or maybe hated or felt bad. But with my mom, they're able to feel accepted and loved and feel like, well, you know what, maybe there is a place for me here. It's just not in that building. I can listen at home at night, and Tammy's going to let me know that I am loved and I am cared for, and I can grow through that. And it doesn't have, because a lot of times these bigger communities, unfortunately, everybody likes to romance the community, but a lot of times these communities become a thing of control and manipulation through religion and legalism and group think and things like that. And what I think my mom gave for a lot of people for the very first time of their lives, who maybe grew up in that same type of old time religion, which like a lot of these rock stars and like Johnny Cash and all grew up in that stuff. But now they're alone on their own. But at night they're turning on the TV going, oh, I still belong. It's not ultimately the group that gets to make the final judgment. It's God, and God loves me. God really does love me. And I think there was something freeing to that. And I think there was something freeing for the LGBTQ people who grew up that way and were ostracized. And then all of a sudden going like, oh, it's not the group think, there's something greater than that, and I don't know if, Paul Tillich, who's a great, theologian, philosopher, talks about grace as reconnection and sin as separation. And I think what they got to experience in that Tillichian way was that reconnection to something greater than themselves. That's that thing that says you are accepted, and that the group, the church, the majority said you aren't, you're sin, you're separated from that. And my parents were allowed to say, no, you're not, you're reconnected to that. It's not based on these other things. And I think that's what allowed a lot of those folks to kind of feel that way. And why you have Elton John making doing a musical about my mother is because he would watch that show late at night and feel that you are accepted, that reconnection, or why Jessica Chastain found that beautiful is because people in the LGBT community felt like they didn't have a place, and they might've not had a physical place to go to, but they had a spiritual place that's like, you are accepted. And I think that's kind of really cool how that played out, especially coming from two people who weren't philosophers or theologians. We're allowed to provide that kind of work. Anyhow,
sure.
That's my 2 cents.
That's amazing, Jay. Man, and Eric, thank you so much for being a guest and shedding your wisdom and
Eric,
setting the
so
context. And Helen, that was great. All the questions you asked, and so thanks, guys. This was awesome. And we'll be in touch, and hopefully, we'll do another episode in a couple of weeks. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.